My name is Daniel, and I work the night shift at a 24-hour convenience store in a quiet suburban town. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it helped pay for my college tuition. Most nights were uneventful, just the occasional late-night customer looking for cigarettes or a quick snack. But one night in late October changed everything. It was a cold, rainy Thursday. The store was empty, and the silence was almost comforting as I flipped through a textbook at the counter. The clock ticked past 2 a.m., and I was just about to make myself some coffee when the automatic doorbell chimed. I looked up to see a man walk in, soaking wet and disheveled. He had deep-set eyes that darted around the store as if he were searching for something, or someone. "Evening," I said, trying to sound casual. He didn't respond. He wandered down the aisles, fingers twitching at his sides. Something felt off. My pulse quickened, and I kept him in my peripheral vision as he moved closer to the counter. He finally stopped in front of me, eyes locked onto mine. "Do you have a payphone?" he asked, voice hoarse and strained. "Outside, around the corner," I replied, pointing. He nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't leave mine. He turned and walked out into the rain. Relieved, I exhaled and shook off the tension, but the relief was short-lived. Minutes later, the doorbell chimed again. This time, it wasn't the man. It was a young woman, barefoot and shivering, with a bruise forming on her cheek. She looked terrified. "Please, can I hide here?" she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Before I could answer, the man walked back in, his eyes zeroing in on her. My blood ran cold. "There you are," he said softly, the tone almost affectionate. He took a step toward her, and she backed into the snack display, knocking over bags of chips. I reached for my phone to call the police, but he lunged forward and grabbed her arm. Her scream pierced the silence, echoing off the tiled walls. "Let her go!" I shouted, my voice shaking as I came out from behind the counter. The man turned to face me, eyes narrowing. His grip tightened on her wrist, and she winced, tears streaming down her face. Before I could react, he pulled out a knife, the blade catching the harsh fluorescent light. My heart pounded as I inched backward, trying to keep my focus. But then he did something I didn't expect. He pushed her away and bolted out the door. The girl collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. I rushed to her side, my own hands trembling as I called the police. They arrived minutes later, sirens wailing, but it felt like hours. The man was never found. They discovered a stolen car parked around the corner, abandoned and wiped clean. The girl's name was Emily. She told the officers that he was someone she had trusted once, someone who had taken everything from her and come back to finish what he started. The sight of her haunted eyes as she recounted her story will never leave me. I quit the job a week later, but I still check the news, hoping to hear they've caught him. And every October, when the rain starts to fall, I think of Emily, the stranger, and the night that changed everything. Number 2. My name is Kevin, and I work the graveyard shift at a gas station on the edge of town. It was the kind of place that saw more tumbleweeds than customers past midnight. Most nights were monotonous. I'd wipe down counters, stock shelves, and occasionally serve truckers or teenagers grabbing snacks. But one night in November, something happened that still makes my hands tremble when I think about it. The night was cold, with frost creeping up the glass windows. I was standing behind the counter, flipping through a magazine, when I heard the bell above the door chime. A man walked in, but there was something unsettling about him. He was tall, wearing an old army jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He didn't look up, just shuffled to the back of the store where the drinks were. I watched him through the convex mirror mounted near the ceiling, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the aisles. He stood there, staring at the refrigerators, not moving. Minutes passed, and he didn't pick anything up. Just stood there, breathing heavily, hands twitching at his sides. I cleared my throat, calling out, "Can I help you find something?" No response. He finally turned and walked up to the counter, but his eyes didn't meet mine. Instead, they shifted around the store, as if searching for someone or something. He dropped a can of soda on the counter, and I rang it up. "That'll be $1.50, I said, trying to mask the edge in my voice. He looked up then, and I'll never forget his eyes. Bloodshot, wide, almost wild, almost, "Is there anyone else here?" he asked, voice low and rough. No, it's just me tonight," I stammered. A small, unsettling smile spread across his face. He leaned in closer, his breath sour. "Good." Before I could react, the bell chimed again. Another man entered, this one older, dressed in a worn-out coat with a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. His eyes locked onto the man at the counter, and he reached into his pocket, pulling out a badge. "Step away from the counter," he barked. The man in the army jacket's smile vanished. His hand shot into his pocket, and in that split second, I knew what was coming. The officer lunged at him, and they crashed to the floor, struggling. The sound of something metallic hitting the tile rang out, a knife gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The officer managed to pin the man down, handcuffing him as he spat curses and thrashed. My legs felt like lead, and I gripped the counter to keep from collapsing. The officer looked up at me, breathless. "He's been on the run for weeks. You're lucky." The man was dragged out, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I learned later that he was wanted for a string of late-night assaults, targeting lone workers. That night, I realized just how thin the line is between routine and terror. Number 3. I work as a night janitor at a small hospital in a rural town. It's not the most glamorous job, but it's quiet, and the pay is decent. Most of my shift is spent mopping empty hallways, sanitizing waiting rooms, and making sure the night staff have a clean environment. But one night last winter, I realized that working in a hospital at night isn't just lonely. It can be dangerous. It was around 2:30 a.m., and the emergency room was slow, with only a few patients in beds. I was mopping the hallway near the maternity ward when I heard the muffled sound of someone sobbing. I paused, listening. The sound came from room 7, which I knew was supposed to be empty. Curious but cautious, I pushed the door open. Inside, a woman sat on the edge of the bed, face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she wept. She wore a hospital gown, and her dark hair fell in tangled waves. My throat tightened. "Ma'am, are you all right?" I asked, stepping into the room. She looked up, eyes wide and red-rimmed. "They took him," she whispered, voice breaking. "They took my baby." Before I could respond, the hallway lights flickered, and a heavy silence fell over the room. I turned to see Nurse Jensen standing in the doorway, her face pale. "You need to leave this room," she said firmly, grabbing my arm and pulling me out. "What's going on?" I demanded as she closed the door behind us, her eyes darting nervously. "That room's been closed off," she whispered, glancing back at the door as if expecting it to open. "A year ago, a woman came in during the night. She had lost her baby, and she didn't make it. Sometimes people see her, but no one is supposed to go in." Before I could process her words, the sound of crying filled the hallway again, louder this time. We turned to see shadows flickering under the door of room 7. The lights in the hallway buzzed and dimmed, casting us in half-darkness. The next morning, I handed in my resignation. Working nights at a hospital can make you witness pain, grief, and sometimes things that can't be explained. But that night, it was the look on Nurse Jensen's face that stayed with me. The kind of fear that tells you some doors should never be opened.